And so today I'd like to talk to you about the first concept in macroeconomics, which is how do we measure economic growth? How do we say that the economy has experienced growth? How do we compare to the economies of two countries such as China and America, or India and Europe? So we do that by doing something called GDP. That's the gross domestic product. That's what GDP stands for, gross domestic product. What it is basically is how does the what is the company exporting every year? So if we have a country, and I'm gonna draw a picture of a country here. I'll draw it, this one here, red, and I'll draw the square one over one that's square over here. And I'll make that blue. So if these are our two countries, circle red and square blue, then what are the GDPs? So let's say that circle red is exporting minerals to circle B. It is exporting minerals, refined minerals. So this is a circle to red circle to blue square, and that is refined minerals. Refined minerals. So this we're gonna call this country A, country B. So A is exporting refined minerals to B, and in turn B is exporting let's say it's exporting oil, refined oil. Refined oil. So it is exporting refined oil to B is exporting refined oil to A. Just gonna erase that right there. So which country's GDP is larger? Well, let's say country A, the total value of all of the refined minerals that it ever exports is valued at let's say $1.2 billion. $1.2 billion. And country B's refined oil is valued at $2.5 billion. So obviously it looks like country B's GDP is higher. They're exporting they're producing $2.5 billion of product, and country A is only producing $1.2 billion of product. So clearly country B has a larger GDP than country A. However, there are many problems with GDP. One of those is that GDP does not take into account something called inflation. You may hear, and I'm gonna write that down here. Inflation. Inflation is where the prices have a general there's a general increase in prices over time. So if I have some bread, if I have some bread, that costs $3 on day 1. I come back 1 week later on day 7. So on day 7, okay, let's write that down here. Day 1. Day 1. And then day 7. Now if I come back on day 7 and I'm going to say that it doesn't look like it. This is the same size loaf of bread, everything, same store. So ceteris paribus, everything else held constant. That term usually only applies to supply and demand. However, that we can explain it over here. So we're gonna say that everything else held constant. We're going to say that this loaf of bread now costs $5. Same size, same loaf of bread, but now it costs $5. 7 days later, the price has gone up $2. So what happened? Well, we have a general increase in prices. When we look at the business cycle graph, we'll see that inflation is caused by when we go over our growth trend line. But we'll save that for the business cycle video. So, as you can see, 7 days later, if we exported only this one loaf of bread, then we can see that if we exported only this one loaf of bread, we can see that our GDP is going to seem much higher, because the GDP here is only $3, the GDP here is $5. But has any economic growth happened? No, because all that's happened is an increase in prices, not the increase in the amount of work that the amount of product that we've exported. So what we have to now add next to this, so in order to compensate for that, we're going to have to add something in front of this GDP. So I'm going to erase this GDP, and I'm going to add a new one. This is called real GDP. Black here. It's called real GDP. The other one, the one that we just looked at, is nominal GDP. Early on in the video, when I showed you when we did that example of country A and country B, I was comparing nominal GDP. That's just the dollar amount. We don't care about inflation or the population or anything. We just need the dollar amount. So that's what nominal GDP is. So I'm gonna write that down. Just the dollar amount. All that GDP is, nominal GDP is. Real GDP, however, is more accurate because it takes into account inflation, which you remember is a general trend in prices usually caused by an increase in the money supply. Which is also why, when we're in an economic crisis, people are wondering why the government doesn't just print and mint more money. Well, if they do, then that will cause an increase in inflation. So the real GDP takes inflation into account. So it takes inflation into account, and as a result, countries which originally had a small nominal GDP, or countries that originally had a very large GDP, become very, very small GDPs, because we can see that if country A, or country B, even though it had such a large GDP, if it had massive amounts of inflation, then its real GDP is going to be less than country A, which we are going to say had no inflation. Okay, now the last thing is even real GDP is not accurate, because we don't know if country A only has 3 people and country B has 10 million people. What are we going to do if that's the case? So what we have come up with is we're going to replace real GDP with, so we started off with GDP. We just started off the lecture with GDP. Then, to make it more accurate, we added real GDP. Now, after real GDP, I'm going to add per capita. Per capita GDP is, what this means is per person. So I'm going to write that down here. Real GDP per capita is per person. So that means if you take basically all of the country's GDP and divide it by the real GDP, and divide it by all the people in that country, then that's going to be what their GDP is going. That's what their GDP is going to. Their per capita GDP is going to be. Now, if we instead take so now that's the real. So now, if we take the situation in which country B has more people than country A, then we see that country A's real GDP per capita is much larger. So that's the case even with today's countries. Luxembourg, smaller countries such as Luxembourg and Europe, and other smaller countries have a larger real GDP per capita than sometimes even the United States and China and India and Europe. So we have real GDP per capita. Now, what things does GDP not include? GDP does not include it does not include intermediate goods. If we had let's say when you're exporting refined oil, the unrefined oil that comes in between the refined and the just the raw coming out of the ground, then that's intermediate good. The machines that are used to process the oil, they do not count in the GDP because they're not the final goods. They do not non-productive transactions. Non-productive transactions also do not count. These include financial transactions, used goods, things like that. Also, illegal activities. There are a number of reasons for this. No country is every country is pretty much too proud to say that their GDP is 90% because of illegal activities. Also, because very few people are going to basically fess up to doing illegal activities for obvious reasons. So not only are they hard to count, but they're also very they can destroy your the pride. So this is how GDP is how we rank our countries. It only occurs every couple of years that we calculate all the countries' GDP. So only in a few years will we know what our current 2012 GDP is going to be.